This is Symbols 5, and with today's presentation, we move to the second of 3 levels. Each one of these phases of our education has 3 levels. And the reason for the 3 levels is rather primitive. It's as simple as beginning, middle, and end. They used to say that if you have 2 dots, you can connect them and that makes a line, and that somehow that's geometry. But the ancient Hellenistic Alexandria Pythagorean understanding of geometry was that a line does not connect 2 dots. A line is when a dot moves, and the vector that it describes is the line. But in order to visualize that line, you need 3 points. You need a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that beginning, middle, and the end, in Greek thought, because early Hellenistic Alexandrian geometry was Greek, the Greek word for that line was mythos. We usually get it in a dramatic version that mythos means plot, as in plot line. Follow the plot line. But plot originally is not a dramatic bit, a geometric navigational term, that you plot your direction, you plot your course. And so the mythos, was the movement of this point. And once you have a line, once you have a beginning, middle, and an end, that you can visualize the line, that line then generates a plane. And so geometry was called plane geometry because it was the shapes that could be made on that plane. The angles, the triangles, the circles, the squares were all figures that were occurring on this plane, which was generated by the line, which was the movement of the point. So that in the early 20th century, one of the most intellectual of all the artists who participated in the revolution of art, Vasily Kandinsky wrote a little book called Concerning the Spiritual in Art. And when people said, what? They didn't understand what he said. He wrote a sequel, like an ABC version, and he called it From Point to Line to Plane, which came out just about the time of the First World War. In a way, Kandinsky's pairing of the spiritual in art with the geometrical underpinning of the way in which perception and conception finally blossom as art is a cue for us. And part of the cue is that we're involved in an education that's an ongoing unfoldment. It's a structure that as it unfolds, it gives us more and more dimensions to work with. And when we began with nature at the beginning of this year, we began with a point which was existentially relevant to our lives. The first activity that we had, the first assignment, first project, first thing that we did was not to read something, but to take a walk from wherever we lived, to take a walk and come back home, and then to make some kind of a record of that, and then to repeat that 3 different times over a period of 3 different weeks. Those 3 random walks were the beginning, the middle, and the end of the first defining line. But the line was not defined so much by principle of the beginning, middle, and the end. You weren't told to take 3 walks. What was said was take a walk. And then the following week, take a second walk. And the 3rd week unfolded, it turned out that you would take a 3rd walk. So rather than being a preemptive design principle, it was a discovery mode of unfolding. So that the beginning, middle, and the end, instead of being a preemptive design principle, which you then stamped on your experience, the experience as it unfolded was given the name of first walk, second walk, third walk, and they were collected together as a set. And that set, in its most simple form, was a linear development. First, second, third walks. But we've discovered, as we've gone along with our education, that when you take a really educated, close look at these simple procedures, they disclose a mysterious quality to them that is usually overlooked in standardized academic education. For instance, if you actually read the very first sentence, the very first definition in Euclid's geometry, written 2,300 years ago, he states very clearly that the point is a locus of no dimension. Now that's very Zen. Long before there was a Zen. Now how can a Greek geometer of 23 centuries ago talk about a locus of no dimension? Because he's generating the visualization archetype of geometry out of the mystery of nature, not out of the certainty of the mind. Geometry, in the Pythagorean sense, was never to do with the certainty of mind. It was always to do with the mystery of nature. The clarity of mind was that it was clear that nature was a mystery, and that all mental constructs were constructs in the mind and not in nature. They were not there in nature. Their geometric clarity was something that was visualized in the mind, and they were symbols. And so the Greek term symbol actually meant thrown together, not designed together, not pieced together, and especially not fitted together, but thrown together. There was a dynamic implosion, and that dynamic implosion burst into mental visibility as the symbol. All of this is lost in the kind of slipshod education that's foisted on us and has been for the last 100 years or more, especially exacerbated by the way in which education was turned over to business and political concerns after the First World War. In fact, the very first book on education to be published in 1921 was by a man named Robert Callahan, published by the University of Chicago Press, and its title was The Cult of Efficiency in Education. The inculcation of business practices into the educational procedures so as to grind people out faster in a more uniform way so that they could be used more readily for the building up of corporate structures. And we're now about 75 years into this experiment, and one can see that it produces a very efficient world of boredom and tears. But this is not an education that grinds anyone out, but rather refines to the extent that you participate in it. You can grind as fine as you want, but your activity is an unfolding that has within it a different kind of movement from that of a projected principle, cookie-cutter stamping out expected form. The form that's here develops and functions better as it develops. It's familiar to computer designers or mathematicians as an algorithmic progression. And the development of algorithmic progressions began in the United States about 140 years ago. A man named Charles Sanders Peirce. And Charles Sanders Peirce, who's forever famous for a collection of philosophic essays called Values in a Universe of Chance. And Peirce was a friend of William James and the early John Dewey. And Dewey and James developed pragmatism, the philosophy of active experiment, learning by actual doing. And pragmatism comes out of Charles Sanders Peirce's development of a function-based intelligence. You learn while you do, but you keep factoring back in what you learn so that your doing becomes progressively refined. This whole development of a philosophic technique of learning by functioning is quite distinct from the learning by cookie-cutter rote. And one of the books that we have before us in Symbols 5 to begin this particular phase, the second phase of symbols, is Susanne Langer's Philosophy in a New Key, written originally in 1941. And Philosophy in a New Key is written as the new key of function-based learning. And the fulcrum for function-based learning are symbols. And the symbol writ large is the idea, but not the idea which is there in a proscriptive ideal, which was characteristic of the kind of thought of the 19th century, Kant and Hegel, idealism, transcendental ideals, or the thought of the 18th century, which was empiricism, David Hume, John Locke, the idea that one could get down to the data of sense perceptions, down to the exact iotas of what sensation was, because wasn't that the basis upon which everything was built? It turns out, Ms. Langer records in some of her essays that empiricism and transcendentalism, the empirical and the ideal, became at loggerheads with each other, and in the work of Charles Sanders Peirce and following people, especially in the mathematical field, it was realized that the fulcrum and the focus of the confusion was not in the sense data, it was not in the ideals, but it was their common root in language, so that the structure of language, semantics, the semantic quality of the process of language was where one should look to develop an intelligent way of proceeding with finding out not only what there is to know and how you know, but more importantly, who is the knower? Who are we? What the hell is going on here? That some physiological, organic creature like ourselves can find out not only about the world and not only about knowing, but find out about ourselves to the point of changing ourselves. And not only changing ourselves, but changing the world. The world of 1996 is radically different from the world of 1896 or 1796 or 1696. So that our transformational character applies to the knower, to the known, and also to the ways in which knowing happens. All of this changes, all of this improves, and there's not a guaranteed progressive line of improvement. There are many eras, many times where things regress, where phases that had been once thought to be out of date or surpassed or improved are regressed to and adopted again and again. Now, in terms of our education, we're always pairing books. We found in our education that if you take a book as a text, that this inculcates, both consciously and subconsciously, this inculcates a kind of learning which is not functional at all, but which is proscriptive. A kind of learning which became codified, energized and codified about 1,000 years ago. The use of the text to orchestrate your learning is a high medieval scholastic technique. But so effective was that technique that it lasted up until the 20th century. It lasted for about 1,000 years. If we choose to do an end run around this technique and not deal with books at all, we will have to recreate everything in the background of man. We will have to start from scratch, and indeed we could do that. But we wouldn't live long enough to really achieve any kind of level that's useful. So our technique is to take the demon by the horns, by both horns, and learn to ride him. So we take the book, but we don't take it as a text which would dominate us, because the form of the book by now and the inculcation of the book's structure into civilization, into our personality, into our history, is so deeply rooted, it's like an empire. It's like a Roman Empire that if we try to step outside of it, we feel surreal or ridiculous. But instead we use a kind of a revolutionary intelligence. We use a little technique from algorithmic developments. We pair books. Instead of taking one at a time, we now take them as a pair. And paired with Susanne Langer's Philosophy in a New Key, we're pairing William Blake's illustrations to the Book of Job. Now, his illustrations to the Book of Job, when you see them in book form, they're a series of pictures. A series of pictures that have a few lines of writing on them. But largely, if you look at Blake's illustrations to the Book of Job, and you see this series of pictures, if you laid out Blake's illustrations to the Book of Job, what you would see is a title page at the top and 21 plates. Now, anyone with just even a cursory experience with a linear series of symbolic illustrations that have an unnumbered title page and 21 numbered sheafs, anyone with any kind of just cursory knowledge recognizes that this is the major arcana of the tarot deck. The Fool card is numbered 0, and then there are 21 major arcana in the tarot deck. So in a very curious way, William Blake's illustrations of the Book of Job are like the major arcana of a tarot deck that belongs somewhere in a wider world than what the tarot decks have come to present. And one can look for a common ground between Blake's illustrations of the Book of Job and the modern tarot decks. The modern tarot decks come from the early Renaissance. But the roots of the tarot decks go back to the 3rd century of our era, 3rd century BC, or AD. In the 3rd century AD, the classical learning that had held for about 2,000 years was suddenly classified as pagan learning. The new kind of education, the new kind of learning, the new Roman Empire learning was Christianity. And towards the end of the 4th century AD, it was made a death penalty if you continued to educate yourself according to the old learning. You had to have the new learning, the new Roman Christian education, exemplified finally, because they were looking for some kind of textbook to bring all this together, exemplified by St. Augustine's City of God. And the City of God became, for 1,000 years, the text by which you were educated. And you understood everything in terms of this. Finally to be replaced after 1,000 years by an improved version, Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica. And that was the new text and continues today to be the official text. The book by which you will learn all things, what there is to know, how to know, and who the knower is. But of course there have been men and women who have taken exception to these kinds of strictures. And the very first group of men and women who took exception before St. Augustine even began to write his City of God. The old wisdom, the so-called pagan wisdom, was formulated in the late 3rd century AD into a pattern of symbolic images, and they were written down in the late 4th century AD as a series of symbolic pictures, pictographs, symbolic hieroglyphic pictures, and they were passed off as the hieroglyphics of Horapollo. Horus Apollo. Horus for the Egyptian, Apollo for the Greek. And so the Greco-Egyptian, Alexandrian, symbolic mentality, which was at the late 3rd century AD, separated from the early 3rd century BC, Euclid and his geometry, by about 600 years. And right in the middle of that 600 years is the time of Jesus, the time of Christ. So the time of the New Testament splits in half these two great Hellenistic eras in the city of Alexandria. The beginning of it was geometry, and the end of it was a symbolic geometry. And in the meantime, about in the middle, geometry developed a capacity to deal not only with the plane, the two-dimensional plane, but with the three-dimensional sphere. And that transformation was the development of geometry to trigonometry. And trigonometric functions have to deal with all three dimensions, and in fact, one can add to trigonometric functions a time dimension so that you can deal with 4 dimensions. But 4-dimensional Alexandrian mathematics of the early 3rd century AD was suddenly charged by a 5th dimension that was added at the time. And the 5th dimension was consciousness. And the all-time great teacher of that particular 5-dimensional continuum of the mind was Plotinus. When that kind of learning was outlawed by pain of death, the last patron proponent of that was the Emperor Julian, who reigned for 3 years, 360 to 363 BC, AD. And when it was found that the young Julian was being successful in bringing the old schools of wisdom back into play, he was simply X'd out. And the generation of people who came in after him in 364 AD simply went around with a sword. Do you believe? How do you think? And as soon as you spoke, They could tell whether you followed the old way or the new way. One of the great examples in our time is that the Nag Hammadi Gnostic material was buried in 364 AD in a place, a little village on one of the bends of the Nile River, a little village called Nag Hammadi. But if one looks at where Nag Hammadi is in that little bend on the Nile, it's right across the Nile from the ancient site of Abydos. And Abydos, 3000 BC, was the place in which wisdom was gathered together to unite Upper and Lower Egypt into one kind of symbolic terrain, one kind of symbolic landscape that became classical pharaonic Egypt. The Nile River is the spinal column, the delta is the brain, and right at the place where there would be the medulla of the connective way in which the higher functions interfaced with all of the lower functions was located the Great Pyramids. So the Great Pyramids of Giza were like the medulla of the brain, of the spinal column of ancient Egypt. And all of that kind of learning came to a crashing end to 3,364 years. It was suddenly outlawed. And the way in which it was preserved was to condense all of the words, condense all of the images into compact symbols. And those symbols arranged in a learning pattern of 21 images indexed by an overriding 22nd image. And that 22nd image always carried a designation of unknown. Not unknown because you don't know, but unknown because you know that you don't know. A kind of a Socratic ignorance. But the Socratic ignorance had its root back in the old mystery of nature, that nature was mysterious, not because you didn't understand how it worked, but because you did. And what you understood was that it really is mysterious. It's mysterious in the sense that nature is always ready to respond to any creative development. And that if men and women develop something entirely new, the universe responds by making it real. That somehow Mother Nature loves the play of her children. And that when we play for real, she makes that real. And so as we add images and words and symbols and ideas and archetypes and new phases to the universe, Mother Nature makes them real, confirms them. And in this mysterious protean quality, we've discovered that we're free. We can make any kind of a universe that we would like to make. But we have to learn to transform our language. We can't call it the universe anymore. What they called it 2,300 years ago was the cosmos. That the universe is the mystery of nature, but the cosmos is the complementary mystery of what continues to be made, what will be made creatively by our participation with it. All of this understanding was compacted, folded, put together, condensed into a series of 22 symbolic pictorial. Can we call them cards? It's hard to even call them cards. Arcana, it means simply hidden. What Blake called them originally was not even illustrations. He called them inventions, but he meant it in a complementary sense that the imagination, when it has a primal energy, that nature provides the energy and man provides the imagination, and that nature's mysterious energy, when it infuses the free imagination of man, is able to be fertile, and it makes forms that are living. so that the symbols, the symbolic illustrations to Blake, were not dead things on a page, but were living entities that lived in the symbolic realm of the mind. And that their life in the mind was fertile, so that symbolic entities in the mind could come back into play, could be applied to a 5-dimensional conscious space-time and find life, futurity, activity, efficacy, and algorithmically elicit out of the mystery of nature some kind of new world. Now, this is revolutionary talk, and they meant it that way 200 years ago. Now, one can find, if you are very refined and you look at the esoteric development between, say, 360 AD and roughly 1360 AD, when the first tarot cards in the Italian Renaissance were coming out. In that 1,000 years, there are still traces of how all this was passed on. One can see that, for instance, in the great Gothic cathedrals, like Chartres especially, that the floor plan of all great Gothic cathedrals, the plane upon which the transcendental towers rise, that the floor plan has a symbolic plane that divides itself into 22 different functions. And if one pieces the 22 symbolic images together, they make a floor plan of a cathedral, of a temple of transformation. Not many people know this anymore. Not many people understand this anymore. But 200 years ago, when William Blake was a very young man, how young? He was 16 years old. His father had prepared him to have some kind of practical artisan preparation. The boy had been a visionary. He saw angels playing musical instruments in trees and sunshine in London, and the father realized that he had a gifted visionary son. What are you going to do with him? You have to ground him somehow so he can earn a living. And so the father, being an ordinary, practical Londoner of that day, decided to apprentice his son as an engraver for jewelry. So that jewelry and then finally little engravings so that the son would pay attention to detail. It's like fathers today telling daydreaming sons, you've got to pay attention to detail, otherwise you're never going to earn a living. The young visionary, William Blake, 16 years old, was apprenticed to a man who just got a contract to engrave one of the great Gothic monuments of England, Westminster Abbey. And so William Blake was put indoors, and he was left there for 5 years to engrave every detail of Westminster Abbey. But he was a natural visionary. And so while he's engraving all these years, he's also looking and seeing in his symbolic visionary capacity that Westminster Abbey is one of the all-time great secular Gothic transformational temples. Its architecture and plan were made to convey the living into the transcendental beyond and bring them back through the power of symbolic inculcation and consciousness. And sure enough, when he was 21, after 5 years of apprenticeship, he was there for his graduation degree in vision. The age of 21, the very month that he was to complete his task and leave Westminster Abbey, they opened the sarcophagus of Edward the Confessor, the first great English king. And when they opened the sarcophagus, there was a death shroud that had been placed over the body. And as the body had decayed, the impress of the body went into the shroud, and engraved the features of Edward the Confessor in all sharp detail, so that when they pulled the shroud back, there was the spirit photograph of the man. And Blake, nodding to himself and humming merrily, went out, understanding that he had been shown a mystery. He'd been shown how reality works. And it took him just a few years to develop the engraving process, by which he took language and symbolic images and impressed them onto copper plates, so that when those copper plates pressed themselves against handmade paper, against the vegetable world reduced to its symbolic structural fibers, woven into a new kind of fiber, the parchment, that it would impress the language and the symbols upon that paper in such a way that someone taking one of those symbolic, living, fertile forms and impressed it upon the senses and the mind of a viewer, that image, that symbolic entity would impress itself and make something living happen in your consciousness. So that the mind, instead of being a tomb of dead, useless academic knowledge, was a fertile mystery ready for the rebirth of whatever could be seeded by true symbolic pictures and words. A revolutionary technique. And Blake, all his life, believed that he was the prophet of a completely new religion, a completely new mankind. And when he developed this, his confreres were men and women who believed equally that all of this would be possible. His favorite woman was Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary Wollstonecraft not only wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Women, but was the most intelligent female radical of her day. She married William Godwin, and their daughter was Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, who was the wife of Percy Shelley. And Mary Wollstonecraft, many of her early works were illustrated by engravings of Blake. Another one of his friends was Thomas Paine, the great writer of the tractates The Rights of Man, and many other, a great friend of Thomas Jefferson, the makers of the American Revolution. It was Blake's timely warning to Paine to exit England before he was killed that saved his life. The great engraver Flaxman, who brought back the idea of Homeric line designs that would bring back the quality of Greek linear perception, the Greek outline form that influenced people like Josiah Wedgwood, who was a part of the Circle, who then made the Portland vase that became the whole basis of the iconography of Greek classicism brought into English life, and English mind became Greek classical based ever after that. Erasmus Darwin was a friend of his. Blake engraved his botanic garden and learned the sinuous plant level of life and how it matched with Gothic and how its secret design was Greek. And all of these influences came together in Blake. This kind of symbolic power made a whole age of revolution. That revolution, by the beginning of the 20th century, was being rediscovered in a way that would forever transform the way in which human beings would look at themselves. It was only about one generation between the death of William Blake in 1827 and the beginning developments of Charles Sanders Peirce in the 1850s. Just one generation in between. But Blake was rediscovered. He was largely ignored in his own time. Very few people even knew about him. But he was rediscovered about the time of the First World War. about the time when this philosophy in a new key was getting its real energy and real starting. And the two great figures that brought philosophy in a new key into play and made it powerful. One was Ernst Cassirer in Germany, and his book, Language and Myth, which we've been using in our myth section, was translated from German into English by Susanne Langer. And Philosophy in a New Key is dedicated to her English teacher, Alfred North Whitehead, who, along with Bertrand Russell, wrote Principia Mathematica. And Russell's work in mathematical logic developed the whole theory of types. And the whole theory of types is a restatement of the old symbolic sets of five-dimensional consciousness from the great Alexandrian Hellenistic times. In Alfred North Whitehead's Process and Reality, the great process philosophy of algorithmic periodicity by which intelligence learns to learn better and better, and so learns in such a way that its field of inquiry becomes exponential. One doesn't just learn in an arithmetic progression or a geometric progression, which is even faster, or a trigonometric function, which is even faster than that, but in a way that includes a five-dimensional leaping and bounding, now called quantum jumps by the popular language. It means that one learns by whole orders of intelligence. Rather than learning something new, one learns whole indexing orders of something new at a pace which is infinite and not traceable at all if one is still working with little lines. And so academic intelligence in our time is not only regressive back to old Neolithic models that are no longer operative and haven't been for a couple thousand years, but they're comparatively even less useful than old Paleolithic models. No wonder that the popular idea of the hero is a Paleolithic caveman with a laser gun rather than Neolithic patient farmer. But the Neolithic and Paleolithic are completely out of date and have been for several thousand years. Symbolic civilization that came in over 2,000 years ago itself has transformed into something so new it doesn't even have a name. And learning and intelligence is not only light years, but whole cosmos beyond what passes as education. In the Second World War, General Patton said, "Fixed fortresses are monuments to past military stupidity." When you have the mobility of the tank on a battlefield, fixed academic universities with expensive plants and out-of-date curricula are tombstones for the dead and dying. There's no place in the future for that kind of intelligence, because the future is completely new. It's creatively happening now. The algorithm is completely outstripping the capacity of them to even follow what's going on. They can't even read the program. They can't even find the list of players. They don't even know what the rules are to the game. Anyone who puts money and time into that kind of effort, it's like buying a plot of land in forest lawn. A very comfortable death. This education is different, totally different. And its operative functioning improves the more that you do it. But prepare to be prepared. Because as your functioning improves, your capacity to envision what is going on will take its indexing jumps. And your assessment of who the knower is, who the participant is, will likewise transform and begin to be contagious, because you'll begin to understand by the actual doing of it that not only can you transform from one form to another, but you can transform the process of transformation so that it becomes improved algorithmically as one goes along. Supersonic speeds are nothing compared to hyperspace. Nothing. Let's take a break. We're exploring. Rather than talking about something, we're exploring. We're using language to explore. I don't have anything written down. There's no play here. The play is in the play of what we're discovering as we're going along. So that there's spontaneity. One of the qualities of an ever-opening context is that freedom is the only energy that works. And the only dynamic that holds that energy into its spectrum of possibility is love. Love and freedom. Energy and dynamism. When Susanne Langer finished Philosophy in a New Key in 1941, it was received around the world as one of those epical books and was reprinted in a very large edition in 1951, Harvard University Press. And with its dedication to Alfred North Whitehead, she decided that the new, larger audience for Philosophy in a New Key should have a sequel, and so she dedicated the sequel, entitled Feeling and Form, a Theory of Art Developed from Philosophy in a New Key, dedicating Philosophy in a New Key to Whitehead. She dedicated Feeling and Form to Ernst Cassirer. But she didn't exhaust in Philosophy in a New Key and Feeling and Form what she found. In fact, it developed so that for the next 2 decades, she wrote a 3-volume trilogy. And the title of it is Mind, an Essay on Human Feeling. She finished it in 1982. And the dedication for Mind is to them in whom I hope to live, even to the great world peace, my children and their children. She dedicated it to the future. Mind, an Essay on Human Feeling. And one of the great seminal ideas of Susanne Langer makes her one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, a century of superstars. She's right there. That the intelligence of feeling has its own patterning, and that pattern, the pattern of the intelligence of feeling, is a template for the possibilities of thought. She writes somewhere, I am scouting the possibilities that intelligence and feeling precedes thinking. That thought follows the template that feeling has already pioneered. And if feeling is matured into a really living fabric of possibility, then thought will be free. Thought will have a field of inquiry that's really fit for it. Instead of some reductive target gamesmanship where you have to go through the rote paces of target practice to get the instructional goals and then total up and see how you did, that all of that are like little ritual rabbit runs for lab rats. None of it has anything to do with the true scope of the mind, much less the true scope of feeling. That feeling intelligence is not only copious, the symbol for it is the cornucopia. It's fruitful of being fruitful exponentially. But she establishes in Philosophy in a New Key that part of the difficulty is that feeling, the intelligence of feeling, belongs to experience, whereas the intelligence of thought belongs to like some essential, integrated, meaningful, symbolic core of experience. But both symbolic essence and languaged experience are both founded upon ritual existence. And so when one looks for the roots of intelligence, the roots of freedom, the roots of our possibility, and we trace back, we see that yes, it does come with existence. The taproot is there. And existence is here in the body. The body objectively registers existence. It's on the basis of the body that feeling experience is able to be generated, and that in turn interiorized and integrated meaningfully into symbolic realization. So thought and feeling and sensation. Yes, they do fit together. They come together. But that all of that is founded upon a nature which is radically different from the nature that is prescriptively expected. That nature somehow is a collection of things, that nature is objectively there. When the actual fact is that as one seeks to grasp nature, it eludes our grasp. Ever and ever finer, ever and ever larger. And nature turns out to be very mysterious. We characterized it as a matrix of change, which is one of the best phrases that one can use initially. Nature is not a collection of things. Nature is not objective at all in any sense of the word. Nor is nature subjective. It's not a subjective projection. It's not unreal. Nature is not Maya. What is Maya is a world of preemptive expectation that's believed in. The illusion become delusion. That's Maya. But nature's reality is the reality of a mystery play, a process which has no beginning, has no end, and consequently has no middle either. So that in a very peculiar way, there are no lines in nature. There are no myths. There's no mythos. There are no plots in nature at all. What nature has is a phase form free-for-all. And in this phase form free-for-all, there is a quality that one would experience on a limited appraisal of it as repetition. If you put a delimiting, say like a time dimension limit, 1 year, nature seems to follow some kind of a pattern. And then the next time cycle, the next year, it seems to follow that again. And we saw with Mircea Eliade in our symbols section, when we read Mircea Eliade's Myth and Reality and paired it up with Cassura's Language and Myth. Eliade said one of the functions that myth seems to have worldwide is to put into language form, into language stories, into mythological cycles, the repetition of nature in its annual cycle, in its seasonal phases. But as one looks closer at this, experiences mythology deeper, this initial appraisal begins to be transparent, and one can see through it, beyond it, to something else. That the repetition is never exactly the same. There's always little changes here and there. And that if one had the experience of a very long life, say 70, 80, 90 years, one would have lived long enough to see that no years are exact repetitions, that nature has, underneath the apparency of repetition, a scintillation of constant newness. And that scintillation is like an iridescence. And one of the qualities of a good mythology is to allow for the repetitive quality to be expressed, but in a way that allows you to see through it at last to the iridescence beyond it. So that a good myth relates to a ritual which can be repeated, but that ritual that can be repeated must have the ability to allow for the mystery of nature to shine through. The last time the Blackfoot Indians of Alberta were able to give a sun dance was in 1966. All of their sacred implements that they needed to support a sun dance had been taken away and put into museums, either in Ottawa or in Calgary or in U.S. museums or European museums. In order to make new implements, they needed 4 medicine men. And there was only one medicine man left alive, and he was too old to go through the lifelong training to train more. And so they brought together the Blackfoot, the Piegan, the Stoney, and they held a sun dance which they allowed the government of Canada to film in connection with the Glenbow, Alberta Museum in Calgary. And they filmed this last Okan, this last sun dance. But the tribal members who were there at the time wanted the film to record only the ritual, but they wanted to disclose within that ritual film, in their own way, the scintillation of the mystery of nature to those who could see through the film, who could see beyond the ritual repetitiveness. And one sees, for instance, when the great sun pole is brought in, the trunk of a living tree, a pine tree, which had been scouted and singled out weeks before the Okan had begun, the 8-day ceremony of the Okan. And this tree was scouted out and seen, initially regarded as an enemy. That the Sundance pole was, as a tree, an enemy with which the men of the tribe, the warrior men of the tribe, those who had actually experienced battle in their lives. And in 1966, there were still figures who had experienced the Second World War, had actually fought in battles. Only those men could go out and harvest that tree into the Sundance pole. And before they harvested it, they told their war stories, their courageous stories, before the audience of that tree. And in telling those stories, that tree began already its shift to a symbolic entity instead of a natural entity. The mystery of nature allowed for it to transform. And when it had transformed to the point to where the men had told their stories, and were now an attack group able to cut that tree, to kill that tree. They killed the natural aspect of the tree, but gave transformative energy to the symbolic rebirthing of that as the Sundance pole. And so the tree disappeared out of nature and reappeared in the vision of the men, in the vision of the tribe. So that when the Sundance pole was brought back into camp, back into the circle of teepees, the men were singing glorious triumphal songs, which at once could be heard by outsiders as a victory in battle against an enemy, but could just as well be heard by insiders, is the triumph of the bringing of the Sundance pole, the very center, the architectural pivot upon which the whole ceremony would rest, the whole Sundance Lodge would rest. And the bringing of evergreen boughs to intertwine with all the structural elements of that Sundance Lodge, all leaned against poles that had prayers woven into cloth on the tips of those poles, so that when the Sundance pole was raised, the top was forked in such a way that it could hold all of these prayers, all of these poles, which would hold then all of the evergreen structure, and it would relive the tree, which was a natural form, was reborn as a Sundance Lodge, which was a visionary form. The symbols helped to transform the tree into the lodge. And by doing so, the tribe was given a place, a venue, a focus of 5 dimensions, a visionary point. And the woman, the Sundance woman, who's the complement to the men, the holy woman, whose vow sealed the promise of the whole tribe that this would actually take place in spiritual reality, that the vision would be real. The holy woman, all the time that the tree was being transformed into the central pole of the Sundance Lodge, she was cutting and praying over the buffalo tongues, the dried buffalo tongues, which would be the sacred jerky that would be fed to the men who would later go into that Sundance Lodge at its culmination, at the place where the mythological cycle came full round, and the annual cycle came full round to the summer solstice, to noon on the summer solstice, to that point of the natural year, that point of the ritual ceremony, that point of the mythological apex. And the natural year as a circle, the ritual year as a circle, the mythological cycle as a circle, were punctuated by a bullseye of a symbolic fulcrum which was placed in the arrangement of all of this activity concentrically at the very top of that Sundance Lodge, where all the prayers and the poles and all the structure came together. The fork in that pole, and a pair of rawhide thongs were dropped from that target, that bullseye, that context, that 4-part circle of targeting the transformational pivot where the mystery of nature transforms into a visionary conscious time-space where man lives again in a completely different way. And that pair of thongs were fastened to 2 antler tips, and those 2 antler tips put into the shoulder flesh of the young men. And they were to pull themselves free from that constraint during the dance. If they uttered a human sound, if they uttered a sound of natural pain, it would obviate the entire sacredness of the ceremony. The only sound that they were allowed to make was to breathe hard on an eagle bone whistle that was fixed in their mouth, that they clamped on through their pain and suffering with their teeth. And that was the only sound they were allowed to make. The sound of the eagle hunting. The eagle hunting something it needed to nourish itself. The spirit was hunting for that transformational portal to that visionary beyond, through the pain, through the sacrifice, through the suffering, through the ritual, through the mythology, even through the symbolism. What could penetrate through that? Only some groundswell from the mystery of nature that was able to go beyond. And so the mystery of nature is that it penetrates all of the ritual, myth, symbolic phases and goes beyond into something other, something that used to be called, in Western traditions, it was called magic. In Chinese traditions, it was called Tao. We today give it the name consciousness. The great Chaucerian English Renaissance gave it the name dream vision. They hyphenated it because it was like the vision was a dream of consciousness. Not a dream of sleep, but a dream of super awakeness. And so that visionary consciousness was born out of the protean mystery of nature. Because what was presented to Mother Nature was not something but an openness that was focused massively by all of the ritual, all of the myth, all of the symbolism, leaving only one opening, and that was the transformative pivot center. The center was left open. The bullseye in the circles of the symbols, the myth, and the ritual. And the whole reason of keeping the ritual locked in place was to make sure that circle would hold. Of keeping the mythology locked in place, making sure that circle would hold. And the symbolism, keeping that locked. Not to be dogmatic, not to be doctrinaire. On the contrary, to assure that the only place that the energy could flow was at the exact place of openness. Not the dead center, but the living center. And that living center was somehow focused by the courage of the men. Do you remember we talked about, even in nature, we talked about how 70 million years ago, before our species even began to evolve, even began to come out of the level at which life was at that time, 70 million years ago, the time of the great apes, still holding today in communities like the gorillas or the orangutans or the chimpanzees. And Jane Goodall studying the chimpanzees for 30 years, patiently getting to know them, getting to be real with them, getting to be in their ritual cycle, and making a mythology of them by giving them names and giving them relationalities, found again and again that the male chimpanzees established the boundaries. They patrolled the boundaries of the territory ceaselessly, and if they transgress from one boundary to another territory, they immediately elicit a fight response. Conflict. That male energy patrols boundaries and female energy maintains centers. But those centers are not just the center, the geographical center, but anywhere within that territory is the center. But amazingly to her, she discovered that female chimpanzees can transform their centering capacity to other territories. The female chimpanzees are able to enter any other territory without eliciting the fight response. They are welcome. Their centering capacity joins that centering capacity, so that centers exchange. One of the great alchemical discoveries in Hellenistic times. Centers of elements exchange, whereas the defining boundaries do not, they repel each other. Once this element, always this element. Forms will not change with other forms on the basis of their definition, of their defining quality, but the centers of them can exchange. There's such a thing as soul sharing. And it's just as objectively real as the forms repelling. A negative charge is always going to repel a positive charge anywhere in the universe. Even in an inside-out universe where the negative would be a positron and the positive would become a negative charge, you still would have the polarity. Definitions, defining forms, maintain their polarized structure of repelling, whereas the centers always have an exchange transformational capacity. Transformation happens at the living center. In order to find the living center, one has to find a way to get to the center. In Neolithic times, the archetype for finding the center was discovered in a way in which clay was made into ceramics. The development of the spinning wheel for ceramics. If you throw a lump of clay on a spinning wheel, the way to find the center is to take any kind of a stylus or just a thumbnail and introduce it and let it spiral towards the center. And wherever that center is, then you can put in the thumbs. And then you can make the shape. And the shape will hold. The very kinetic energy of the circularity of the wheel complements the structural capacity of the clay. And one can eventually tune one's figures to feel the form in the dynamic. In just this way, a good ritual, a good mythology, a good symbolism is a way to find the center, but one needs to have visionary hands. The thumbs of consciousness, the fingers of consciousness, the feel of vision in order to go in. And what is made out of that is the work of art. Then out of vision comes the objectivity of art. And out of the vision of consciousness comes the form, the objective form of the person. And we'll see next year, our whole first half of next year takes vision and art and how it develops. How this kind of educational technique, this ancient way in which men and women always have found to transform themselves, still operates and still works, even on the large indexing orders that are now available to us. So there is such a thing as an ancient wisdom, and there is such a thing as a completely new future. And they complement each other. They go together. They fit. In our pair of material, one man and one woman, Susanne Langer and William Blake, Philosophy in a New Key, the illustrations of the Book of Job. One of the qualities in Philosophy in a New Key is that the old key was that somehow there was an objectivity to sense perception, and that objectivity in sense perception correlated to an objectivity in idealism. The whole philosophy of empiricism is that one has something real here in the sense world. The material world is real. It's the basis upon which we make real ideas. They have to correlate. They have to match up. You have to face the facts. But Blake lived in a revolutionary generation that looked closely at this and saw this was not true. Not only is it not true, but that it's misleading to even suspect that it's true. One of the very first publications of Blake, 1788. If you're into synchronicities, 1788 is the beginning of the United States, the first administration of George Washington. All of these qualities of historical concentricity are what are going to engage us in the third quarter of next year. Because once we go look at vision and art and understand somewhat what's going on there, for the first time, will see that history is a process. That history is a very mysterious process, just like nature, just like mythic language, just like vision. History also is a very mysterious process, and it's protean, and what comes creatively out of that process, precipitates out of that process, is as objectively real as existence, as the mind, as the person. And that the form that precipitates out of the oceanic process of history is the cosmos. Quite real. Scientifically real. Objective. Holds. Foundation. Base. Trustworthy. In 1788, Blake published his first little book, his first engraving experiment, and the title of it is There is No Natural Religion. Little postage stamp size. And he did a second series where he raised the size up to a little bit larger postage stamp sizes. Here's how it reads. These are the engraved words. The argument, man has no notion of moral fitness but from education. Naturally, he is only a natural organ subject to sense. Man cannot naturally perceive but through his natural or bodily organs. Man by his reasoning power can only compare and judge of what he has already perceived. From a perception of only three senses or three elements, none could deduce a fourth or a fifth. None could have other than natural or organic thoughts if he had none but organic perceptions. Man's desires are limited by his perceptions. None can desire what he has not perceived. The desires and perceptions of man, untaught by anything but organs of sense, must be limited to objects of sense. Conclusion? If it were not for the poetic or prophetic character, the philosophic and experimental would soon be at the ratio of all things and stand still, unable to do other than repeat the same dull round over and over again. It's like Eliade pointing out that one of the colossal dangers of early men and women, and consistently paid attention to by the intelligent men and women for thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of years, is that while the ritual has to be repetitive to the detail and the transmissible accuracy so that it works as a form that will hold that energy, it cannot be a dead round. If it's reduced to a dead, unknowing rote repetition, then one begins to carve a rut instead of making a form which will hold living energy. The rut will be a groove where the energy will be trapped. And so ritual has at once two completely different functions at the very same time. It has to be repetitively exact, but if it is exactly repetitive, it ends up in imprisoning us, defeating us. This quandary, this polarity, haunts early men and women. And where it comes out, where the corrective quality, the balancing comes, is in the way in which mythic cycles are handled. A myth is always told a little bit differently in each telling. One of the qualities of living myth is that it's always a little different. If one sees a classic ancient storyteller, ancient mythographer, I remember one time in Calgary, Alberta, I think I might have told some of you who've been through the course, I brought in Hanson's Bearpaw, who was at that time over 90 years old and blind and didn't speak English. his great-nephew, who was about 40 years old, did the translating. And it was at the Indian Friendship Center in downtown Calgary. There were about 120 tribal members there because he was revered, plus about 100 people in the course on world mythology. And before he spoke, he got the cadence with his storytelling stick. He got the ritual cadence of the way in which you pattern language so that its cadence is exact, it's traditional, it's ancient, it's never been modified, never changed, it's always exactly in that cadence. And the words are woven into that cadence, but in such a way that the words tend each one to slip a little bit out of the cadence, so that each word has its kind of winged quality, its freedom, so that someone who is hearing spiritually will never hear it exactly the same in any one given rendition. Even though it has a repetitive base quality, it has a grammatical, syntactical quality, which is repeatable and memorable. And once you hear it, it's always there. It's like if you ever hear someone intone the Upanishads, it's always the same. And the Upanishads intone sound like American Indian chants. No wonder. If one hears an ancient form of spiritual language, it has a recognizable cadence, but each word within it is independently mobile and free, so that the spiritual sense becomes alert. And that intelligence comes all the way down to 20th century poetry. One time when he was challenged, Dylan Thomas lashed back at a critic in London. Not just a Welshman lashing back, but a poet he said, a good poem leaves little chinks open so the lightning and thunder can come through. A really good poet doesn't polish to death the poem. He leaves it living so that someone who is really there with that poem, they will elicit from their hearing something unique to them from that poem. And part of that space is what goes there into the dimension of the center. And the central openness is not made as a cutout of what is left after everything else is formally locked in. But the center is the symbolic thrown together of all the little opennesses, all the glints of insight that are brought together. That's why it's called symbolion in Greek, thrown together, implosive. It's dynamic. It's not a cutout that's dead. It's a center that's alive. We call it in science today, we call it in astronomy or astrophysics, we call it a barycenter. In a star system, the star is not the center of the system. Most star systems are multiple. Which center are you going to choose? Alpha Centauri has 3 different stars. The center of a star system is the gravitational center. It's a point of no dimension. It's in space, but it's not in space where there's anything. It's the focus of all the forces, the barycenter. And so the openness of an ecology of spiritual men and women is the barycenter. And one establishes that by letting the magnetic field be free. And one does that by shaping the electromagnetic material into its concentricness. And while that shapes into its concentricness, the magnetic energy is free to make its sphere. And in doing so, this electromagnetic targeting and this magnetic sphering will create a barycenter presence that is reachable if one takes a conscious visionary 5-dimensional pair of hands and puts it on, one can find where that is. That very center is in a stillness of presence, which never occurs in nature. Nature is never still. It's always scintillating, seething matrix of change. But the seed of conscious differentiality is quiet, still, point of no dimension. Not left out after everything else is cut away, but there by virtue of all the dynamic being focused together. So that there's a further reach of integration. Integration goes as far as it can, and when it does, it collapses in upon itself like an inside-out black hole. And instead of further integrating, it like reverses its polarity and begins differentiating. And we use still the old Pythagorean term for that. It resonates. When matter is shaped, when ritual is shaped, when language is shaped, when symbols are shaped to their ultimate bell-like firmness and you ring it, the sound radiates out. It resonates out. And in our time, the late 20th, early 21st century, we could graph on various sonar equipment, oscilloscopes and so forth. If you ring a bell, the sound takes the shape of the bell. Whatever the shape is, the sound will take that shape and radiate out. But the sound will register in its resonances only at certain energy intervals. And those energy intervals arrange themselves into a set, and that set is called the harmony. The harmony of that tone, and that harmony is real. So real that one could strike all of the notes in that set together and make a chord. And in ancient Pythagorean geometry even that early, the chord is the diameter of the wholeness. That's the way it used to be said about 2,500 years ago. The chord is also the measurable caliper by which the spectrum calibrates itself. And what's amazing is that calibration is transformable. In simple terms, sound can be organized into music by a scale, and there are infinite scales that one could use. Not just the octave or the 8-note set that we inherit from classical times. There are an infinite number of scales. Each scale is a set, has its own chord. So that the possibility of freedom for our kind is unlimited. There are no limits whatsoever. When Blake found that his engraving process worked on living people, transformed and transmitted the symbolic quality, not that was inside him and from inside him then put inside someone else, but that his symbolic barycenter, focusing this in him, would focus it in someone else in their way. It wouldn't be his center that was in them, it was their center that was awakened. And the curious thing that Blake and the revolutionaries of that time noted is that when men and women are awakened, their centers hum together. That kind of an awakened population form a community of a harmony. And that the possibilities of a society based on that and not on political forms was staggering to them. They didn't know how to do it. We still don't know how to do it. But the commitment was that somehow this has got to be looked into. In the 20th century, Susanne Langer's Philosophy in a New Key is one of the real firm steps towards exploring that possibility. The succeeding volumes, Feeling and Form and Mind and Essay on Feeling, take us a long way into that. A long way into that exploration. One of the qualities that's indispensable is that thought without feeling is perilous. A purely abstract form divorced from its feeling fabric intelligence becomes regressive almost automatically. Thought without feeling tends to ally itself with cold ritual. So that a symbol which becomes powerful tends to regress and use its power on a ritual level. This is called black magic in ancient times. It's a bad stuff. Now you could be a little humorous like Bill Murray in Ghostbusters saying, I'm a little shaky on good and bad. Well, can you imagine the whole possibility of the cosmos being erased forever as an option? That's bad. Okay, Ray. Next week.